This lecture is based on Chapter 2 taken from the textbook Introduction to Food Service Management in the New Millennium, a Computer Lab Manual. Chapter 2 is titled Malnutrition and Disease Prevention in the 19th and 20th Centuries. As large populations migrated from the rural countryside to the large urban centers during the peak of the 19th century Industrial Revolution, in search of higher-paying factory jobs, a grim and dirty iconic picture of the industrialized age gets drawn by historians. The new urbanite had to shift his reliance from rural-derived garden produce to a dependency on the rather narrow inventory of newly created grocery stores. Consequently, the urbanite, unlike the rural farmer, was limited to a sparse diet of starch, tinned meats, and bread by early winter, as the reserves of cabbage, leeks, and onions, high in vitamin C or ascorbic acid, dwindled, igniting scurvy outbreaks which swept through the city's poorest districts. So in this context, there are a great deal of highly processed foods that get produced through this high-tech revolution that's taking place with the Industrial Revolution. And the prime example of that is, of course, the mechanized milling, which refines the flour and rids it of its real nutritious properties. So we have these large urban centers that are being created, and there's a need to feed the populace that are now, sort of converging in these large centers, and we end up with food production that is really focused on volume and quantity, but not so much on quality. And we see impurities in the processing that's in the production that's going on, and we see also low standards of food safety, resulting, of course, in a lot of food poisoning. The technological advancements fueled an industrial revolution facilitated by public health reforms that permitted large-scale urban manufacturing to take root, which revolutionized the labor force and the economy with higher wages near the end of the 19th century. By embracing the innovative hydraulics, automated conveyor belts, mechanized milling, and the railway, the food industry could produce and distribute food at a much greater scale. Unfortunately, the interest in large volume production overshadowed the concern for food quality and food safety. Up until the 1800s, the American family manufactured 85% of the goods in the U.S. It grew and cooked its own food. It sewed its own clothes, produced its own furniture, and managed its own transportation. However, between 1800 and 1830, the American household transitioned from producing to a purchasing unit. Household goods had to therefore be bought outside the home. So the U.S. home thereby became more commercially dependent on food to feed their families. In the 19th century, the health reform movement, which decried the modernization of the food supply, was surfacing in the U.S. Sylvester Graham, in his treatise on bread and bread making, encouraged individual households in a time of vanishing self-sufficiency to purchase the highest quality unrefined flour for baking homemade fresh bread. The health reform movement was in a way inviting the American public to re-embrace wholesome food and to stay away from the too highly manufactured and processed foods, which the movement perceived as unhealthy. And then finally, the discovery of vitamins and the quantification of macronutrients in food in the early 20th century changed food I guess, in three distinct ways. First, the micronutrients imbued food with a scientific and medical dimension. Food had become more of a medicine in a way. Second, nutrition became an integral part of the business and manufacturing and marketing of food. Suddenly, vitamin profiles and concentrations could make foods very nutritious. And third, laws, codes, labeling standards regulated food. Now, between the 1950s and 70s, emphasis was placed on managing the many chronic diseases that started to surface, especially from the excess fat and sugar intakes. The worrisome rise in the prevalence of chronic disease, most especially since the early 1980s, has been the impetus for issuing U.S. government dietary guidelines for the population. So when we look at the national healthcare expenditure in 2010, it was as high as 2.6 trillion a year, and this national health expenditure rose again to 3.6 trillion in 2018. Now, 75% of that healthcare expenditure is dedicated to the management of chronic disease, and a mere 3.2% goes towards public health. Now, what chronic diseases are we talking about? Well, essentially, it's the obesity epidemic that is really driving the many chronic diseases that are secondary to obesity, notably cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers. So, with this rise in chronic disease, one would have to ask, what exactly should we be eating? What exactly should health officials be saying to the public about what to eat? And more specifically, what should individuals, professionals in the food service industry be focusing on when they're preparing their menus? Well, very simply, there are three main steps that should be followed in order to ensure population health. First, follow the dietary guidelines for Americans 2015-2020. Second, meet the healthy macronutrient range recommendations. And third, avoid or limit processed foods that are high in sodium, in sugar, in cholesterol, in saturated fat, and in trans fatty acids. Now, these are the guidelines that individuals that are professionals in the food industry need to pay attention to. When developing your menus, these are the guidelines that menu makers need to basically focus on. So let's look exactly what it means to follow the dietary guidelines for Americans. Well, healthy eating guidelines are important, and the new ones that we have here for 2020-2025 are very much similar. The core of the recommendations are similar to the dietary guidelines of previous years. However, there are three new focuses that we find in these guidelines. The first is the recognition that there are diet-related chronic diseases that represent a major public health problem, such as diabetes and obesity and cardiovascular disease. The second is that these guidelines focus on dietary patterns. Researchers and public health experts really understand that the nutrients that we eat are really affected by the patterns of foods that we eat, and that these have direct effect on our health. And the third, of course, is the focus on the lifespan approach, looking at the application of these guidelines at every lifespan, starting from infancy right up until old age. So what is the whole package, if you will? Well, regular exercise is part of a lifestyle. Keep foods low in saturated fat, cholesterol, and moderate in total fat. Include a variety of foods within the My Plate, especially the fruits, the vegetables, and the grains, and moderation in sugar, alcohol, and salty foods, and really essentially consume safe foods that are free from bacterial contamination. Now, if we look at the My Plate food guide, we can see a very simple representation of proportionality on the plate. And we see that the fruits and vegetables and grains make up 3/4 of the plate. And notice that the protein segment is, used to be called the meat and alternates. And the research now has been so convincing regarding the association between large meat consumption, specifically processed meat, and cancer, that it was almost impossible for the cattle ranchers of America and the meat marketing boards to resist the change from meat and alternates to basically protein foods. And protein foods, of course, include meat, include chicken and beef and pork and all these, and fish, but also grain, legumes, for example, that are more of a vegetable protein. And so it includes and encourages a more diverse form of protein intake with some emphasis or possibility on vegetable protein intake. So the message comes right down to choosing sensibly. And so here are some of the steps I think that are noteworthy that you need to remember as you start thinking about your menu development. And here are some very good, sensible steps. Sodium intake should be less than 2,300 milligrams per day. Alcohol should be in moderation. Now, specifically, total fat should be between 20 and 35% of the calorie requirement, with fats being mostly from the mono and polyunsaturated oils, and of course avoiding the trans fats and keeping, of course, saturated fat less than 10% of calorie requirements. Again, kind of keeping the trans fatty acids under 1%. Total dietary cholesterol should be less than 300 milligrams per day, and the fiber intake should be somewhere between 25 and 40 grams per day. And the focus here should be from fiber-rich fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and of course an emphasis on breakfast cereals that are high in fiber. So it's very good to be practical and make practical recommendations. And here I'm making really minimum recommendations for good health. And what that means is to choose fruits and vegetables so that you're consuming at minimum 5 servings of fruit and vegetables a day. And that would really involve about 2 cups of fruit per day. That's cup equivalent using the Choose My Plate .gov guidelines, and 2.5 cups of vegetables per day. And choosing from vegetables like dark green, orange, starches, legumes, and others that are more substantive with their phytochemical content as well as their micronutrient content. And then to choose whole grains, at least 3 servings per day, or half of the bread and cereal consumption should be whole grains. And then choose foods that are of high nutrient density and that have controlled caloric density. And the way to minimize calorically dense foods is really to avoid processed foods as much as you can in the development of your menus. So we're going to look at how to use the ChooseMyPlate.gov serving equivalents here. And if you've not learned this will be a great opportunity to get that information under your belt. And for those who already know it, it'll be a good review. So what the guide teaches us is that, on average, the average individual, average adult needs about 3 to 8 ounces a day of breads and cereal. and 1 ounce equivalent is listed below. So a half cup of cooked rice, or a half cup of macaroni, spaghetti, or pasta, 1 slice of bread, for example, and you can read the rest of the list. And you should be able then to be able to assess somebody's intake. For instance, if somebody has a cup of rice, that's 2 ounce equivalent. 2 slices of bread, that's 2 ounce equivalent. So 2 slices of bread and a cup of rice would be in effect 4 ounce equivalent. So you students should have that sort of competency in understanding these different groups and how to use the ounce equivalent or the serving equivalent depending on the food group. So of course, when it comes to carbohydrates, to breads and cereals, there's really a minimum intake for an individual that isn't very active, and that's probably about 3 ounce equivalents per day. And you can find moderately active individuals requiring maybe 8 ounces equivalent per day, and very active individuals who train for a sport having even more than 8 ounce equivalents per day. So it's a matter of understanding the level of physical activity and of energy demand. So what about vegetables? Well, with vegetables we don't talk about ounce equivalent, but we talk about cup equivalents. And we're recommending minimally that people consume at least 2 to 3 cups equivalent per day. So what is a cup equivalent? It's 1 cup of vegetables, frozen or canned. It's a half cup of tomato sauce. It's 2 cups of leafy raw vegetables like spinach or lettuce. It's a cup of vegetable juice. It's a cup of cooked legumes like pinto beans or black beans. 1 large corn on the cob, a cup of corn, a medium baked potato, a cup of mashed potatoes. So you can see a lot of it revolves around the cup. What I want you to take note of, though, is that when we're talking about legumes for a vegetable, 1 cup equivalent is really 1 cup of cooked legumes. This is indeed important to take note of, because when we start talking about protein foods and we're talking about legumes, it's going to be different. In the same way as vegetables, when we talk about fruit, we're talking about also a cup equivalent. And so we're looking here for about 1.5 to 2 cups per day. So what's a cup? Well, 1 large banana or orange is a cup equivalent. A medium pear is a cup equivalent. A small apple, or 1 cup of applesauce. A cup of whole grapes, sliced peaches, whole strawberries, or mixed fruit, that's 1 cup equivalent. And a cup of orange juice, 100% juice, is 1 cup equivalent. And a half a cup of dried fruit is 1 cup equivalent. So when we're talking about proteins, we're talking about ounce equivalent, and the need is about 5 to 6.5 ounces equivalent per day. So what is 1 ounce equivalent of meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and beans? Well, it's a 1/4 cup of cooked legumes. Now, notice that when we're talking about a protein, it's a 1/4 cup. When we're talking about legumes as a vegetable, it's 1 cup. So make sure you make that distinction. 1 ounce of tofu, 1/2 ounce of nuts and seeds, 1 egg. 1 ounce of cooked meat is 1 ounce equivalent, and 1 tablespoon of peanut butter. Now, when it comes to milk or dairy products, we need about 3 cups per day, and 1 cup equivalent of milk, yogurt, and cheese really amounts to what? 1 cup of yogurt, 1 cup of milk, 1.5 ounces of natural cheese, 2 ounces of processed cheese, 2 cups of cottage cheese, 1 cup of frozen yogurt, and 1.5 cups of ice cream. So here's a little exercise to help you better understand how to prepare. So identify the number of servings of breads and cereal. If a patient consumes 1 cup of cornflakes, 2 toast, 2 pats of butter, and 1 medium bagel. Well, the total should be, first, a cup of cornflakes is 1 ounce equivalent, and then 2 toasts is 2 ounce equivalents, so that's 3. And then 1 medium bagel is 2 ounce equivalent, so that becomes 5 ounce equivalent. All right, let's try this one for an exercise looking at meats and beans. So this is really the protein category. So 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, 3 ounces of steak, and 1 cup of cooked Romano beans. So pause here and try to calculate the total number of ounce equivalent. Of course, you've got the answer here. It's 9 ounce equivalent, but see if you can come up with that answer. All right, so let's take a look. 1 tablespoon is 1 ounce equivalent, so we have 2 ounce equivalents here. 1 ounce of meat is 1 ounce equivalent, so we have 3 there, so that's 5. And then 1 cup of cooked Romano beans as a protein, that's 4. So that's 2 from the peanut butter, 3 from the steak, so that's 5, plus 4 from the Romano beans, and that's 9 ounce equivalent. Remembering that a quarter cup of cooked Romano beans is 1 ounce equivalent of protein food. So I invite students to practice the myplate.gov guidelines in a similar way as these 2 examples that I showed you, so that you become very proficient with it. Now, the second step is really to meet the healthy macronutrient range needs. And so we're going to take a look at what these ranges are. Well, here are the ideal recommended macronutrient ranges. So it's important for students to memorize these and to know them cold. Carbohydrates, 45 to 65% of energy requirements. Protein, 10 to 35% of energy requirements. Now consider this range, and consider that the WHO recognizes that most human beings really only require 15% of their energy requirements in the form of protein. But these guidelines that we have in the United States, 10 to 35, really accommodate, in many cases, some extreme sports and extreme conditions that aren't usual in terms of normal human requirements for protein. So when you're developing your menu, you can certainly think along the lines of 10 to 15%. It's important to consider this because once you go beyond 15%, you have to realize that protein starts to become very expensive. And so I really encourage students to stay between 10 and 15%. And then fat, 20 to 35%. Now, important thing here is that when it comes to recommendations for a population or a group, low risk for cardiovascular disease really is associated with 30% or lower than the DRI calories. And again, I encourage students to be somewhere around there and to try to avoid the 20%, because the 20% means that there is a chance that the patients will fall under 20% when it comes to actual practical eating, right? The actual application of eating food. So it's good to stay away from the lower ranges. So in practical terms, it means that when you're developing a menu, you might be looking for a specific percent for the macronutrients rather than the ranges, right? So you're aiming for one specific percentage. So for example, you could say carbohydrates might be 60%, and it's certainly between the 45 and 65% range, so that's okay. The protein at 15%, so that's between 10 and 35, and fat at 25%, so it's under 30%, but it's away from the lower range or the lower end of 20%. And then when you add the percentages up, they need to total 100. Now, what do these percentages actually mean? Well, percentages actually mean that they are healthy macronutrient ranges that are associated with low incidences of disease. The goal really is to consume carbs and protein and fats that fall within these respective ranges. They allow you to determine the total number of grams that are found in each of the macronutrients, really in about 2 steps. In this way, you can establish how many grams of protein, fat, and carbohydrates you are consuming. And for menu planners, you can establish how many grams of these particular macronutrients you are planning to serve to the patients. So here's an application. So if you consume 2,300 calories a day, or if you're applying your menu to meet the needs, which are calculated to be on average 2,300 calories per day. If the macronutrient distribution is as follows: 60% carb, 15% protein, and 25% calories, then you should be able to establish the grams of carbs, of protein, and of fat. So let's start. So if you've got 60% carbohydrates, so it's 60% of 2,300 calories. So that's 0.6 times 2,300, and that leaves you with 1,380 carbohydrate calories. And then 15% protein, that's 0.15 times 2,300, and that leaves you with 345 protein calories. And then 25% of the 2,300 calories is fat, so that's 0.25 times 2,300, and that's 575 fat calories. Now, in the next step, it's about taking those calories for carbs, so that's 1,380 carbohydrate calories, and dividing that amount by 4, because there are 4 calories for every gram of carbohydrate. And that leaves you with 345 grams. For the protein, we remember we had 345 protein calories, and there are also in protein 4 calories for every gram. And when you divide it by 4, it leaves you with 86 grams of protein. And we had 575 fat calories, and fat is very different than protein and carbohydrates, so there's 9 calories for every gram. So we divide the 575 by 9 and we get 64 grams of fat. So here's a key principle to remember, and that's the 449 principle, that 1 gram of carbohydrate contains 4 calories, that 1 gram of protein contains 4 calories, and 1 gram of fat contains 9 calories. So now the third step is about limiting the processed food on your menu and in your personal food choices, because these processed foods are high in sodium, they're high in sugar, they're high in saturated fat, they're high in cholesterol, and they're especially high in trans fatty acids in particular cases. So consequently, when you're looking at your menu and you're trying to design the menu, you're going to be evaluating the content of your menu based on the sodium and the sugar and the saturated fat contents. So it's important to find ways to make your food choices much healthier than what we see in the normal population. Now, in the next step, I'd like to review the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1990, and to look specifically at labeling, because these labeling guidelines are going to help you understand what is a high-fat product, what's a high-sugar product, what's a high saturated fat product, and so forth. So it provides you with a quantifiable limit on these particular nutrients that are consistent in a way with this nutrition labeling guideline. So here are the principles of the Nutrition Facts panel. A nutrient is considered, or a food we should say, is considered as containing an excellent source of a nutrient if the nutrient is 20% or more of the daily value. It's a good source of the nutrient if it's 10 to 19.9% of the daily value, and it's poor in the content of that nutrient, if you will, if it's 5% or less of the daily value. Now, not all nutrients can be considered excellent or good. There are some nutrients that we'd like to keep as low as possible. For example, saturated fat and sugar are examples of foods that we don't want them to be excellent sources. So we can use these same guidelines and look at them kind of in a different way. We can say a food is high in sugar or in saturated fat, or in fat if we're trying to control fat, if it's 20% or more of the daily value. It's moderately high in that particular nutrient if it's 10 to 19.9% of the daily value, but it's low in that particular nutrient, saturated fat or sugar, if it's 5% or less of the daily value. And we can add into this that it is actually considered a healthy level if it's greater than 5% and less than 10% of the daily value. So it's important for students to memorize these ranges and to have a good understanding of how to apply them. So here's an example of the old nutrition facts panel on the left and of the new nutrition facts panel on the right. And you can just see here that the calories, for example, are more pronounced. And there are a few other examples that are slightly different. But I want to bring to your attention exactly how these are actually calculated. So for example, if you look at total fat is at 8 grams and it represents 10% of the daily value. Now, following the new guidelines, the daily value really represents 35%, if you will, of a 2,000 calorie diet, and that works out to be 78 grams. So a daily value on the new panel is 78 grams. So if you take 8 grams of fat divided by 78 and then multiplied by 10, you get about 10%. Let's do another example. Look at the sodium at 160 milligrams. So what is the daily value for sodium is 2,300 milligrams. So if we do 160 divided by 2,300 and then multiply that by 100, we get 6.9, or in other words, 7%. And that's how they calculated it. Let's do the sugar. So the sugar, especially the added sugar at 10 grams, how did they get 20%? Well, it turns out that the limit for added sugar is 10% of the daily caloric requirement. So if you do 10% of 2,000 and divide that by 4, because sugar is a carbohydrate, you end up with 50 grams. So if your total sugar is added sugar, that is 10 grams, 10 divided by 50 times 100 is actually 20%. So that's the end of the presentation. I'd like students to practice this food label concept, recognizing that the daily value for sodium is 2,300, that the daily value for total fat is about 78 grams, or 35% of a 2,000 calorie diet, that added sugar is 10% of the total daily requirement,